Hello, everyone. Can
Hello.
everybody hear me?
Yes, we can. At least I can.
Let me see, make sure I can hear others.
Hey.
Oh, I do not have the right speaker selected. Okay. Now I can hear. You can hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Awesome. Cool.
Yep.
Morning.
Good morning. All right, so we actually have a pretty full schedule here, so I am going to just get started now. But to do that, let's go ahead and do introductions. And while we're doing introductions, if more people filter in, that is awesome. And they are mowing outside my door. Hopefully you can hear that. Okay, so let's go ahead and just get started with some intros. Let's say our name, our pronouns, and a fun fact about yourself. I am going to use myself as an example. Hello, I am Doug, he, him pronouns, and over the last few months, I have become unhealthily obsessed with Star Wars Legos. Okay, and I'm just gonna call on people. Nicholas.
Giving me no time to think on that one. So I'm Nicholas, he, him, pronouns, and I guess fun fact about myself. I can't think of any fun facts on the spot, so that's my fun facts.
Well, I had fun. Blake.
Yeah. All right, guys, my name's Blake. He, him pronouns, to follow in the vein of Doug. My two biggest interests right now and things that I want to talk about to anybody are the sketch comedy show I Think You Should Leave and the Cold War.
Awesome. Matthew.
Matt's fine as well. He, him pronouns. Fun fact, I'm currently in Taiwan, so it's midnight over here. So this is some dedication to come join you guys today. Good to see ya.
Damn, that is
Always
cool.
fun.
That is cool. Appreciate that. Good to see you here. Justin.
Hey guys, Justin, he, him. Fun fact, I do a mean Donald Duck impression.
Like a Donald Duck impression that is impressive, or like it's Donald Duck but very mean?
I can do both.
Oh wow, okay, awesome.
I'll prove to you sometime, Doug.
Okay, sounds good. Noah.
Noah, he, him. Fun fact about me is when I was a child, they told me I'd be 6'1", but I only made it to 5'9.5". So that's my fun fact.
They really set the bar high for you early just to let you down like that. That's not fair. Okay, awesome. All right, so I am going to go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. Thanks a lot for attending today's political education session. That's part of our ABCs of Socialism series. Today we're meeting to talk about the essay, Why Do Socialists Talk About Workers So Much? This has been a continuing series from the ABCs of Socialism by Jacobin, published by Verso. Today's format is going to be a little different from the last two, I think, just a little bit. As I was preparing to put together today's session, I was doing research. I was researching content from the author of the essay itself, Vivek Chibber, and I found this really good video of him discussing this exact essay. As I was trying to put a presentation together, I realized I was just like copying everything that he was saying, and thought, you know what, why reinvent this wheel? So I can't do it better than the author. So for today's presentation, and there will be two of them, I'll be playing parts of this video, and in between that we will have discussion. And I'm going to reshare the agenda link in here. If you take a look at the agenda link, you'll see a link to our community agreements, but also kind of a generic timeline there. And then for discussion questions, I will paste those in when we get to that part so that you know, we can have somewhere to look at them when we're thinking about what our answers are going to be, or in our breakout sessions. So with that being said, I am going to get started with the first part of the presentation. And it's going to be a video that Vivek Chibber actually did specifically about this article that he wrote. And I think it's an excellent if you didn't read it, it's an excellent way to get the content. If you did read it, I think you can even pull more out of it than what was even in there. So let me get started here. I'll share my screen, share my sound.
Thank you, Jason. I lived in this country now for 35 years, and it's been mostly a very depressing time. Except for these last 4 or 5 years, and it's been pretty amazing to see in the United States, which I had sort of thought I would not see in my lifetime, something like the emergence of at least the first glimmer of a genuine political culture. I don't think we're there yet. It's going to take a very long time for it to happen. But at least people are coming out and starting to think about the way in which society as a whole works, and what kinds of issues it'll take, what kinds of mechanisms and drives it'll take to actually change that society. Towards this, I think this series that Jacobin is putting out on socialism, the talks that Jason is organizing, play a very important role. And I'm amazed to see so many of you out here on a cold night. All this portends well, I think, for us. Let's see how long it goes on. But as long as the moment is there, I think we should try to do everything we can to deepen it and to take advantage of it. The issue before us today is why socialists constantly, or in an inordinate amount of time, focus on the working class as a strategic factor in society. Now, I think, to get straight to the point, there are a couple of fundamental reasons why socialists do so, and I think they're very sound reasons. And you can think of this as one being a diagnosis of what's wrong in modern society, and the second being a prognosis of what to do to make things better. Both of these point in the same direction. So let's start with a diagnosis. The diagnosis focuses on what kinds of things people need in their life to have a decent shot at happiness, at decent social relations with others, all the things that go into what we call justice, fairness and justice. And whatever else is needed, and there are many things that are needed for social justice, there are two that just about everybody agrees on. One is certain basic minimum material goods. People cannot lead decent lives if they are constantly worried about having enough to eat. They cannot lead a decent life if they don't have basic health, if they don't have housing, if they don't have certain material provisions that go into consolidating their everyday life so that they can strive for what they would regard as a higher end of things. Creativity, love, friendship. All of those things are harder to sustain when you don't have certain basic goods. So first of all, you need these goods. Secondly, for lack of a better term, autonomy. Or you can think of it in a more cumbersome way, freedom from domination. The basic idea is, if you are under somebody else's thumb, if you're being dominated by somebody else, there's always a chance that that authority which they have over you will turn into abuse. And being dominated by somebody else, therefore, means that the priorities by which you live are not going to be your own. They're going to be the priorities of that person who has power over you, which means that you don't essentially get to set your agenda, whatever that agenda might be. Therefore, if in modern society people lack these basic material goods and they lack autonomy, that is to say they experience domination, whatever else they need, it's going to be a society in which justice is very hard to achieve. Now, what socialists say is that capitalism is a social system which systematically deprives people of both of these, both the material goods that they need and their autonomy. And the reason is simple. Capitalism runs on the principle of profit maximization. Or to put it differently, it puts profits over people. Now, why does that undermine both of these things? Well, most people in a capitalist society have to work for a living, and they go to work for somebody else. While they're working for somebody else, their employer, the employer's priorities are not set by what is good for the employees who are working under his authority. It's set by the firm's goal of maximizing profits. And the reason he has to prioritize the profit maximization principle is if he does not maximize his profits, he dies. The firm dies. Because the only way he can survive is by wringing as much money as he can out of his economic activities so he can take that money, increases efficiency, increases competitive strength so that he can beat out his rivals. The thrust and the force of competition compels capitalists to always look after the bottom line. Now, the bottom line ends up being injurious to everybody else, and this is the fundamental problem. The flip side of profit maximization is cost minimization. Every firm has to try to maintain, hold its line on whatever cost it has so as the profit margins can be increased as much as possible. But cost minimization has an immediate impact on workers' lives because what they take as their income, which is their wage, is their employer's cost. So cost minimization means that every employer tries to pay as little as he can get away with when it comes to remunerating his workers, which means that workers, therefore, have to constantly be under the threat of their basic means of livelihood being set not by what they need, but what their employer can get away with. That's issue number one. Issue number two, while they're at work, they have to surrender their autonomy to their employer. The wage contract essentially says, I'll come and work for you, you give me some money, and for the duration that I'm working for you, I'm under your authority. What I do with my time, where I stand, where I go, who I talk to, how many bathroom breaks I get, where I look, how fast I work, is not at my discretion. It's at the discretion of the employer. And that waking time, for most people in the world, is most of their waking day. That working time comprises anywhere from 2/3 to 3/4 of all the time that they're awake, which means, effectively, if you think of a person's active life as the time of their life that they're waking through the day, it means 3/4 of their waking time is under a loss of autonomy to somebody whose interests are lined up against their own interests. This lack of autonomy inside the workplace is oftentimes compounded by being under their employer's control outside the workplace. In company towns, in cities where judges and legislators are bought up by the employer, even political authority is under the capitalist hands. Therefore, for both of these reasons, it is built into the structure of capitalism that these fundamental preconditions for a just society are systematically undermined by the rules of the system itself. All right, so what that means, therefore, is that in order to move towards a more just social arrangement, you have got to figure out how to get people these basic provisions and greater autonomy. And this has been the struggle of the poor since the birth of capitalism, trying to establish non-market access, or at least non-contingent access, to these things which they need for decent lives. The problem is, every time the poor have tried to advocate or ask for or plead for greater insurance of these things, they've every time, everywhere come up against the resistance of their employers. Within the workplace, if they ask for higher wages, if they ask for more control over the workplace, if they ask for more authority over investment decisions, every time it comes up against the recalcitrance of the employers. And also when it comes to outside the workplace, because of the employer's greater social power. The basic problem is power in capitalism is not distributed equally. Not only do employers get to set the agenda within the workplace, they also have the authority and the power to set the agenda for society at large because of their control of the state, because of their greater resources for lobbying, because of their ability to buy politicians, and fundamentally because as long as they control investment, they control the creation of all the wealth and all the income of society, so everybody has to constantly worry about whether or not they're happy. this leads to a strategic problem, which is if the vast majority of the people in a capitalist society are denied the basic goods that are needed for social justice, and if every time they ask for them, they are denied to them by political authorities because of the influence of the capitalist class, how do you get them? Now, this leads then to the second factor after the diagnosis, which is the prognosis of how to fix things. The prognosis is, in order to have a better chance of life for the vast majority of the people, since power centers are not going to give them up voluntarily, you're going to have to extract it from them through a countervailing power on the part of the poor. It's a practical issue. The practical issue is if the bourgeois state and the capitalist class, which has the power, does not allow the poor, by its own generosity, these basic things that it needs for justice, where is it going to get the means to get it from them? And the answer can only be by extracting it from them through a countervailing power on the part of the poor. And this is where the strategic and practical importance of the working class comes in. The working class is unlike any other social grouping in the non-capitalist section of modern society, which is that however penurious it is, however dominated it is, however atomized it is the goose that lays the golden egg. It is the source of profits, because unless workers show up to do their work every day and create profits for their employers, that principle of profit maximization cannot be carried out. It remains a dead letter. Workers, therefore, have the following opportunity, if they can take advantage of it, which is that they hold the lever to the sluice, the stream of profits that keeps the system going. Capitalists have the authority over them, but unless they agree to do what their employers say, the employers are left simply holding the bag, no profits for them. Workers, therefore, become important for a strategic reason, which is that they're the agent and the only agent that has a structural place within the society to bring the power centers to their knees. Now, that is a capacity that they have, but they also have an interest in using that capacity for obvious reasons. All of those liabilities, all of those constraints which I've laid out, which are in the way of moving towards a more just society, are most keenly felt in society as a whole by the working class itself. They are the vast majority of modern society. They also happen to be, I'm going to finish way before, among the poorest end, and they are the ones who every day suffer the indignities, the deprivation, the loss of autonomy, the backbreaking work pace, the insecurity and the anxiety of what to do with their lives when they're under somebody else's thumb. They're the ones who suffer this. And hence, they therefore have not only a capacity, but also an interest in coming together, banding together, and struggling towards those ends which we think would generate more just social arrangements. All right, so for socialists, therefore, they learn through hard experience that if you want to have a better society, you're going to have to aggregate power in some way. And this is, even today, the power center of society. Now, there's an important implication of this, for this, especially since many of you are people in and around universities and university crowds, and you've suffered the misfortune of sitting through social theory classes and all that in the last 20 years. Among progressives and in the radical left, the key category in the last 25 years has been the margins, marginality. Embracing the margins, advocating for the margins, being the margins, loving the margins. If it's marginal, it's good. Not that there's anything wrong with the margins. But understand this, the reason the working class is important is because it's not marginal. And you're going to have to get over your love of the margins if you want to do effective politics. This doesn't mean that you consign minority groups, other social oppressed groups to insignificance. Quite the contrary. Anybody fighting for a just society has to take every form of marginalization and oppression as being incredibly important. But understand that politics is not just about moral advocacy. It is also about the practicalities of achieving power against the power centers in an unjust world. The thing about the working class, what makes it important, is that it is central. It is the central social category and social group within capitalism, of course, second only to capital. Which means, therefore, that the reason you go after it is because of its centrality to the system, not because of its marginality. And that means that the tenor of political debates has to change. Quite often you walk into a meeting today and the discussion will be about whether or not this group is fighting for the margins, is looking for the margins, is bringing the margins in. That's great. If it's a code word for saying we have to make sure every indignity, every injustice is something that we're concerned with. But understand that you also have to ask, who are the central and the key players in this society that can bring the kind of changes we need? And therefore, not just in our politics, but in our understanding of the system, we have to move beyond the obsessions with margins. And we have to start thinking about the nucleus, the core, and the foundation of modern society, and building and establishing power within those foundations. Right now, at this moment, the left is the weakest it has been since its birth on this issue. And one reason it's embraced the margins is that that's the space that it inhabits. But the fact that you've been pushed into the margins doesn't mean you should embrace it. The agenda for the left for the foreseeable future is going to be to figure out how to get out of the margins into the nerve centers of capitalism, because that's where the power is. And until you're able to aggregate and use that power towards different ends, you're not going to get the kind of society that most moral people want. That's why socialists focus on the working class, and I think they're right to do so. Thank you.
Okay, so that was, I think, a good summary of the essay that we were to read today. Why do socialists talk about workers so much? I think it goes a little bit beyond the content that's in there, but he makes a lot of the core arguments and then kind of expands on them. So I just thought that there was no way I could put together a better presentation than that. So once again, I am going to share the agenda link in the chat for those who have joined after I shared it last. And what we are going to do now is the first part of the discussion. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to put us into breakout groups, 4-on-4. And we are going to, I have a few questions here to talk about during that discussion session. So I'm going to copy those questions for discussion into the agenda so that you can see them. And however the discussion goes, there doesn't have to be an answer on every single one of them, but I think all of these questions that I put in here are related. So that should be able to get a conversation started. So I am now moving us into breakout groups. I'm just going to assign them automatically. Here we go. Okay. All right. So what we're going to do next is we're going to do part 2 here. This one's a little bit longer. This is a kind of a Q&A. I think every question is so good on this. And anyway, we're going to play that. And then after that, we're going to go back into breakout groups for just a little bit and then come out into the main room. And that's how we're going to play out for the end of the session. So I'm just going to go ahead and get started here and yes, enjoy.
Thanks, Vivek. That was fantastic. I think it was incredibly useful. I have just a few questions to maybe elaborate on some of the things that you said, and then again we can kick it open to the discussion. So the first place I want to start with was where you started with capitalism. I mean, in the book you say capitalism can't deliver the goods, and I'd like to start there because I think it's important how firm you are on this, both in the book and in the talk that you just gave. Because when criticism of capitalism does make it into mainstream discussions, it's usually of the sort of that late capitalism has gone off the rails, or it's neoliberal capitalism. It's some sort of variant of capitalism that has really just gone amok. And I think what you're suggesting here, and what you're saying outright, is that capitalism will inevitably produce injustice, and then as a result, it will inevitably generate class conflict, right? So I was just hoping you could maybe address that a little more.
Yeah. Two ways to look at this. You're absolutely right that the code word for everything now has become neoliberalism, and it's become the stand-in for anything that counts as a genuine analysis of modern society. And that's partly because much of the left discourse is overwhelmingly dominated by nonprofits and academics. And capitalism is still a no-no. You can't really bring up capitalism. So you need something else, and it's very useful to say, well, it's not capitalism as such that we worry about. It's this right here. It's Reaganism, it's Thatcherism, that sort of thing. And there's no doubt that the current variant of capitalism is truly inhumane, certainly more so than the one that preceded it. So that's one reason why you don't see the word capitalism very much. But first of all, it's important to understand that if you compare today's version of capitalism with its place in history, it's actually not the exception. We're reverting back to capitalism's pure form. This is what it is. What it is a system in which everybody is thrown out onto the market and they're told, sink or swim, man. It's up to you. The era of getting social supports, some kind of social insurance, basic guarantees, the welfare state, that was an era that's been around now since about the 1930s and 40s, but it was a departure from the norm in capitalism. So in a sense, we're going back. Neoliberalism is actually simply just capitalism in its pure face. Now, there's two ways, as I said, you can look at this. One is on an absolute scale. Does capitalism on an absolute level actually deny people what they need on an everyday level? And the answer is for most of the world, even on that absolute scale, it fails. It fails because most of the world now is in a very unalloyed barbaric form of a market society in India, in China, in Africa, in the Middle East. These are all places in which the vast, vast majority of the people still live barely at a subsistence level. And that's not an accident. That's because of the fact that they have to work for employers that simply don't care what's going on for them. So on an absolute scale, for the most of the world, it is failing. The other way to look at it is on a relative scale, which is in a country like this, in countries like Western Europe, it's of course true that poor people, the working people, have gotten a lot for themselves, and their lives are actually quite decent. But what we say when we bring up a relative scale, what we mean by that is not just relative to the rest of the world as is, but relative to how they could be living given the state of productivity, given the state of technology, given the state of the country's infrastructure. Could their lives be better than they are now? And the answer is absolutely. Finally, to the extent, and this is the key point, to the extent that workers in the West have managed to get better lives for themselves, this has come about because they aggregated their power precisely in the way that I was saying. The reason the welfare state arose in the West at the time that it did was because of enormous and violent class struggle in which labor unions managed to extract these concessions from employers in a way that had not been possible previously. So as long as you have capitalism, this not only are you going to have to fight for everything that you have, but those things that you have are constantly going to be under threat from the employers who never wanted to give them to you in the first place. And that fight that I talked about, that antagonism between employers and employees, therefore, is written into the system. You're not going to get rid of it. And this is why socialists have said you can have a more civilized capitalism, and you should fight for that more civilized capitalism, but understand that it's like a cancer. You can keep giving it chemo. You can beat back the growth of the cancer cells, but they always keep coming back. And that's why you want a different system.
So the main argument of the piece is that workers are the key social agent. This is the revolutionary agent. So I guess it's important to actually say what a worker is. And what I mean by that is, in the last 5 years, you talked about these enormous explosions of social struggle. So, Occupy Wall Street is where a lot of this started, which was fantastic. It put on the map the sort of idea of 1% versus the 99%, which was really useful because all of a sudden you have millions of people talking about just vast gulf of, the huge inequality in the society on every level. But at the same time, what it does is it sort of enshrines a conception of class as how much you make or how much you own, right? Which isn't exactly what we mean. So what is a worker?
Let's start with a step slightly further back in the way you presented it, because I think it's a good way to think about it, which is that it's been a very effective rhetorical tool to talk about the 1% versus everybody else. and that everybody else is defined as a negative category, whoever is not in the 1%. And the assumption is, or the implication is, that they all not only are worse off than the 1%, but they can all come together in some way as an effective social group. And on a very narrow range of issues, that's true. People, the 99% is going to have certain common interests. But a significant chunk of that 99% are people who we'd never call workers. They're going to be managers. They're going to be people who have a great deal of autonomy, who own their own means of production. And therefore, for some of them, like the managers, even though they're not in the 1%, their job is to make the 1% happy by getting more work out of the bottom 60%. And while right now they may not be getting as much money and have as much wealth as the 1%, they aspire to be, and they will try to be in that 1% because there's an actual chance for them to do so at some point. Up on top in society, there's a game of musical chairs. Employers have managers, managers go up a ladder, and the way you make it up the ladder is by screwing over the people underneath you. That's your job. So for the kinds of ends that we are talking about, of actually bringing people together around an agenda to push employers to give up some of their profits for higher wages and other things, managers aren't going to be part of that, and that's why you've never had unions trying to bring in managers, because they know that you're essentially bringing in your enemy. And what that means, therefore, is that this language of income being the divider, or these percentage points being the divider, is rhetorically and in some narrow ways useful, but it's strategically and politically not very useful, and you'll run up against that problem all the time. The key thing for an analysis of capitalism is not what your income is, but what you have to do to earn your income. And I can't say this often enough. It's what you have to do to earn your income. And if what you have to do to earn your income is boss and manage other people, then you're not going to be part of that movement. That's what managers do. On the other hand, what you have to do is submit to the authority and the depredations of these managers and their employers. Now you've got a reason to try to fight against them. That's why class is not the same thing as income groups. Class is fundamentally about which side of the divide you're on, whether you're extracting labor or whether it's your labor that's being extracted.
So the next question I have is sort of rhetorical, but ironic. Do workers still exist is what I have written down here. And the reason I have that is because, there's arguments out there that workers have won important gains in the past, but they're not a relevant force today, right? And so every few decades, there's this sort of new theory that emerges that the working class is disappearing for one reason or another. Today I was, preparing for this, I was reading some stuff and I saw one such call to like rethink Marxism entirely. It read, the automation process continually replaces the manual worker. When these developments reach a certain point, the whole Marxian thesis will need substantial revision. And that was written in 1933, right? So like, which is to say that we hear these things dusted off every couple of decades as a brand new cutting edge theory about why the working class is irrelevant. And so I would include in that the U.S. is post-industrial, that automation has now replaced workers or will soon, that we all live in a gig economy, that we're too precarious. So it's clearly true that working conditions are changing, and that does mean something, right? But does that change the position and the role of the working class? I would guess you would say no, but why? Why not?
We should not be too quick to say no. First of all, no in a big sense. Nothing is new in the current structure of capitalism in any deep sense. Automation per se, it was very clever what you did, this view that automation is eventually going to end in everybody being out of work and robots running everything, it is not true and it can't be true. And there are a couple of reasons for that. It is, of course, the case that automation continually throws people out of their particular workplace. But the effects of that throwing these people out are always counterbalanced by two things. One is that in a growing economy, if productivity is increasing and the tempo of economic growth is always on the upswing, new firms and new factories and new plants and new places of work are springing up all the time, which then suck up the workers who were thrown out of work by the automation. So there's a dual process going on of some people being thrown out and then those people being sucked up by new firms. This view that automation will result in everybody eventually losing their jobs kind of screens out and ignores this second counterbalancing thing. It just assumes that the existing factories are the only factories, or the existing workplaces are the only ones that will ever exist. And over time, as they throw people out, of course, those people are going to be like the zombies in The Walking Dead. They're just going to be shuffling around looking for jobs, and there's no new jobs. That forgets the fact that you're always sucking these people up into new employment venues. The second thing is this. The automation that's throwing people out of work is the result of technological change, of new technologies, of new machines, of new processes coming in place. And every one of those generates a demand for additional skills and additional workers to continue to produce those technologies, to service them, to figure out how to make them better. Technological change is generating new occupations all the time. So it's always this dynamic process of one side of the equation throwing people out, but at the same time creating the conditions for those people to be sucked into new positions. Now, the key thing is this. Everything rides on the rate at which these two processes interact. Right now, the fears of automation leading to a desert and mass unemployment, those fears are stoked by a reality, which is that in the past 15 to 20 years, the pace of new employment generation has in fact been very slow. And because it's slow, we see the people who are being thrown out either not getting jobs or doing these gig jobs. Temporary work here, there, and here, there. That has to do with the fact, not that automation, we're finally seeing the true force of automation, its bare fangs actually visible once, finally. It has to do with the fact that this particular era of capitalism in the West has been delivering very slow rates of growth, very low levels of reinvestment, and therefore very low levels of re-employment for the people being thrown out of work. Now, that's why I said there's a kernel of truth to it, which is that that does change the conditions for organizing people. It's very different and in ways quite, I would say, a lot easier to organize people when everybody's sure of work, because then they're less afraid of their boss. What we're going through right now is a period in which people are so terrified, so beaten down, that in their jobs, in their workplaces, they're much more afraid of raising their head, raising their fist, than they had been 60 or 80 or even 40 years ago. That means organization is a lot harder. And this is why the existing trade unions, one reason, it's a minor reason, there are much more shameful reasons, but it's one reason why trade unions are not really trying to organize new workers. Their strategy for 25 years has been essentially acquisitions and mergers. You raid other unions, you go to campuses because students are already organized, and you say, the UAW says, see, we're organizing because we brought a bunch of grad students into our union. It's because it's a lot harder to walk into an auto plant. And it's not just harder because bosses have a lot of power over their workers, but the workers themselves are very much worried about the consequences of even taking a step because they know that it's a desert out there.
Yeah, so I'm glad you said that. My next question was about unions. I mean, when we talk about the working class as the revolutionary agent of change, right? This seems very far away from where we are right now, certainly after 40 years of just givebacks and one-sided class attack. Marxists have always supported trade unions, and I think that's the right position.
I think you should say socialists. Marxists are just one strand within them. Socialists.
Fair enough. So socialists support the trade unions, which I think is the right position. But the union movement, it's on its back in major ways, right? Like each year in this country, union density falls to a new low. Strike activity falls to a new low. Most unions are now at this point run by bureaucrats who don't actually seem that interested in actually organizing their workers so much as sort of striking deals at the top with little input from the unions. So given that, given that we need the working class to act, how do socialists approach unions with all of this going on?
So what you're asking is, there might be some reason to focus on workers, but are unions the best vehicle for trying to bring that about, given where they are now? First of all, we need to be flexible about this. The key point is, remember that it's not a moral issue per se, and it's not that there's some aesthetic Hegelian, we read about the master-servant dialectic and we think the workers are servants and we have to get to the chapter 6 of the phenomenology and therefore you go to the workers because, Horkheimer said so or something. It's a practical issue, which is how do you bring capitalists to the table to say, okay, look, we'll give you something. Okay, and we have to be open to the fact that as capitalism evolves, maybe new possibilities open up for how we bring poor people together. Okay. And maybe today there's a greater space for electoral politics because of the incredible role that the state plays in distributing income, perhaps. Maybe neighborhoods are a very important place because workers live there and they can aggregate themselves into larger numbers, perhaps in a way that in workplaces is not so easy. And we have to be open to all those things, certainly. But until we have practical reason and practical experience with these other forms of organization and other forms of interest aggregation, I don't see a way around keeping unions as a absolutely pivotal mechanism, instrument within left strategy. If you can find a better one, great. Let me know about it. I'll help you advertise the thing. I haven't been able to see one anywhere. And the last 20 years have been an interesting experiment in this way. I don't know how many people think about this. The last 5 years alone, we've seen mass mobilizations all over the world. In the Middle East, which brought down a few regimes, in Brazil, in India, where I'm from, in this country. And what all of them have in common is that while labor has played varying degrees of role, organized labor in all of them, it hasn't really been at the core of any of them. The second thing they have in common is they've all met with defeat. They all had lots of people come out into the streets, and while they were in the streets, they made a great spectacle, but they didn't have a lot to show for it at the end of the day. Occupy is a very good example of that. It was a fantastic movement, and it really was the kind of the trigger that got a lot of the current mobilization going. But the difference between a factory occupation and a park occupation is just this, that people in the park have to go home. At some point, they're gonna go home. And elites can just wait it out because production is going on, profits are being made without any disruption. Factory occupations, however, are a whole different thing. So without figuring some way of having an institutional means of bringing workers together, like through a union, I don't know any way around it. It is absolutely true that the union movement today shows no interest in doing this. It shows no interest in fighting. It shows no interest in pursuing the kinds of the goals that the labor movement in the past had. To me, that just means you build a better one. That's all. It's like saying a cure for this disease is not doing as well as you could. But until you find a different cure, you got to keep working on that one. And this is all we've seen. It's harder making this case today in left settings because there are very few workers who come to left settings. So it's harder to make the case that, not forget unions, that even that workers are important because a lot of people who are on the left are students and academics and they want to talk about exotic things. But I don't know any other way around it. So while we have to be very clear-eyed and unromantic about where the labor movement is today and be aware of all of its infirmities and its liabilities, until we find a practical alternative, it seems to me that the only option we have is to make the existing sorts of institutions work better rather than abandoning them.
So I'd like to ask, I guess, a follow-up question to that, because it sort of speaks to, again, the distance where we are today from where we want to be, which is the level, the degree to which workers are not immune from the sort of prevailing ideas of society. There's, the acceptance of racist ideas, sexist ideas, all kinds of ideas that divide workers in ways that are exactly unhelpful to forming these sorts of blocks that could exert power. It's very, very present, especially today. I mean, we turn the news on and see any number of examples of that. And unions in particular, and this is a vehicle that could be fighting against that, it sometimes is, but it's also increasingly not. Or you have some right-wing unions, the building trades, et cetera, that are actually taking on Trump's nationalism because they think it can save them a few jobs in the short term. So we need to figure out how to overcome this. There's this sort of structural difficulty here. How do we start getting a little closer to where we need to be?
There's two difficulties. Okay, let me say this first. The history of the union movement is not a linear one. The history of the union movement, not just here but everywhere, has been a kind of an internal conflict over what the shape and the goals of those unions are going to be. There's always been a ranchist kind of conservative wing which has tried to narrow down the range of issues they take up, simply build on the strength of the most skilled, the most privileged, and thereby sometimes the most conservative workers, and aggregate power by monopolizing scarce resources and keeping other workers out. And that is, in many ways, to what we've returned today. But even in this country, and elsewhere, there's actually a very long and very noble tradition of trade unionists fighting for a wider and more encompassing vision of what the labor movement is. In the United States, in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, communists, socialists, few anarchists fought for that vision, and they had enormous success for it. One of the greatest and most important legacies of that was the fact that in the 1920s and 30s, in the Jim Crow South, it was white communists, white trade unionists who were risking their lives, organizing black workers with black sharecroppers who saw each other as comrades. That was inspired by a very particular vision of how to organize workers. That vision lost out, partly because of the internecine warfare within the labor movement in the 30s and 40s, partly because the American state came down on the side of the more conservative wing of the labor movement in order to make sure that the left didn't win out, which culminated in McCarthyism, from which the left never recovered. But we need to investigate that, be aware of it, and on the left, hold it up proudly and say, this is what we aspire to. That's something that I think we can return to today. And that brings me to the second problem. The second problem is this: there's nothing automatic in the labor movement that'll push it towards a more encompassing vision of how to organize. There's nothing automatic about that. And in fact, there's many reasons why it's rational for workers to take the short-term, the more conservative route, focus on their race, focus on their ethnicity, keep the women out, because it's easier. It's hard work going out and bridging these divides. In the past, it was the ideologically committed socialist left that came to unions and fought for this. The problem today is not just that the labor movement is more conservative, has this racism, has this exclusivist kind of ideology. It's also that people who call themselves socialists have no connection to labor. And to be honest, many of them are simply not interested because of this weight of the university and campus left. It's until the left gets outside the campus, out of the seminar room, until it starts opening up offices in working class neighborhoods, full-time organizers, gets jobs within that, until it implants itself within labor the way it always has until the 1970s and 80s. Until then, you have no way of bringing this alternative vision of organizing into the labor movement. And that's going to make it hard to move towards a more encompassing, more universalistic form of class struggle in this country.
All right, thank you. On a positive note, we'll let the
Okay, all right. Thank you for sitting through that. I think those questions and responses were just too crucial to like not play. So what we are going to do now is we're going to do discussion part 2. I have a few questions here I would like to ask, but we're going to do one of them in a breakout group. And then we're going to come back into the main room for sharing what was in the breakout group. And I have the follow-up question. So I'm going to copy the question into the agenda right now. And I'll put it kind of down below a little bit. Okay. So the question is, what are things we could do as a chapter to bridge the divide between us as activists and workers / the labor movement, and ignore capacity restrictions? This is just for ideas generation. And when we come back, I'd like to have each group like share those things, and we'll write them down here. So we're going to do breakout groups now. I'm just going to automate it. Let me see, recreate, assign automatically. Okay. Let's see, I'm gonna move here, and here we go. Okay, let's see, everybody's in here. Okay, cool. So, all right, so that was the first question. So what I'd like to do is, and go ahead and just feel free to talk on this part, like, what were the things that that were listed or mentioned in your group discussion?
Larry, you're on mute.
I did not mute myself. Yeah, we talked about holding conversations with organically with friends, family, acquaintances, strangers on the street, and maybe organizing outreach to other groups. It was a short session.
Sure. Yeah, so, okay, yeah, so, talking more to people in general, being very much more outward with what, with the project, okay. What else? What about the other group?
We talked a lot about obviously continuing to show solidarity with the existing labor unions that are in the area, and when they do have things that we show up in force and make sure we're known. We also talked about the opportunity with a new Amazon facility apparently moving into the area, and about the possibility of trying to work with either Teamsters or just organically to try and organize that right from the start, and to just even to almost infiltrate the workspace just to try and start that organizing process.
Okay. Thinking about getting in on Amazon union organizing, since one is coming. All right.
We also
What
brought
else?
up, like, this was started bringing this up, was that in Blono, like, one of the things I've noticed that they're doing is they are organizing a tenants union. That is something that, like, if we could do that here, it'd be huge. I think that I'm kind of waiting to see if they're successful in doing something like that. I know that something that has come up in conversations I've had with other members is just like, trying to set up like shop in public places where a lot of Peorians are going to be, a lot of places where working Peorians are going to be, and people that we're wanting to bring into the chapter, so that we can do that outreach to recruit them into this and hopefully start building a larger organization.
I also
Okay.
think it would be a good opportunity for us to join with, not just waiting to see if Bloomington's successful at that, but throwing whatever resources we have to make that successful and see if we can then turn that around to Peoria.
Okay. So what I got here is, okay, so what I have here on the list, and if you check out the agenda, you can see it. Talking to friends, family, acquaintances, strangers, being more external. I have continuing solidarity actions with existing unions, thinking about getting in on Amazon union organizing since one is coming. Well, yeah, so we know what that means. Tenants union organizing and setting up shop in public spaces where working class people will be. So I'd
Can I
like
add
to
another
take,
one?
yeah,
Yeah, I think like the most direct one is just simply joining a union. Go getting involved in the workplace and becoming, agents of uh, making an organization, making a workplace more militant.
rank and file strategy.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. So let's
I
go
have
through
another
these.
one.
Oh, okay.
Training our members on how to organize their own union so that they can do that in their own workplace. That's what they want to do.
Sure. Okay. Got it. Okay. So we got a full list. And so we are set to end here shortly. So if you want to go at 12:30, that is totally cool. I am down for continuing the discussion if you'd like to. But nobody is obligated to stay longer. But okay, so the first one, talking to friends, family, acquaintances, strangers, being more external. The two questions that I have to actually gauge these is, one, do we have the capacity to do this? And then the third one is, if yes, why? And if no, what are some things we could do to build that capacity? So talking to friends and family, acquaintances, strangers, being more external. Do we have the capacity to do this?
Yes.
100%.
Okay,
I feel
so,
like we wouldn't be here if that wasn't the case.
right. So that's a good one. So yes, kind of self-explanatory. It's why we're here.
Self-explanatory. I'd also add though, like we frequently fall into the trap of, like, we talked about this in our group, of using too much jargon and not boiling it down into a simple, like easy conversation. So that's an important aspect to make sure we take into those conversations.
Absolutely. Meeting people where they're at is extremely important. So then the second question then, so when I think of this question, I think of actually doing this outside of this space, right? So like doing this at work, doing this in all the places that society makes you feel uncomfortable doing it, right? So we do have the capacity to do that, I believe. But what, like, I guess I'm kind of bringing up that question, right? Because I get a sense through my experience that people are a lot more timid outside of, just in general, outside of this space, right? When they're going out in the world. So like, what are some things we could do to like improve that?
I do think working on language that is less jargon based and more easy to consume by kind of non-intellectual types, I guess, is important in having those conversations. Because, if you start off on the wrong foot, you tend to turn people away right away. Whereas a lot of times they're on your side, you just have to find the right way to communicate with them at their level. So I think having those conversations on how we talk about this and how we approach it is important.
Right.
I think just like looking for inroads, looking for looking for the inroads of like, how do you bridge from a simple conversation about something and connect it to like a larger issue that in a way that makes sense to them. And I want to use this example real quick. Last week, my girlfriend Marissa and I were out to eat with Doug and Emily. And then after they left, we hung around and Marissa got into a conversation with someone sitting in a bar about fashion. And we started talking about fashion, and then we were talking about fast fashion, and then we were talking about exploitation of labor. And next thing you know, we've got someone new who is interested in DSA, who's never heard of DSA. Now, it helped that she was like already a lefty and a socialist, but she's didn't know what DSA was.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Another thing that I would kind of like to add is like for people who are like timid to like maybe even like go out and talk to new people, because like I feel like sometimes I can be that way. I kind of have that anxiety of talking to someone new in public. But like going out with like a friend and going into a public space, and then that it shares your beliefs, and then like discussing socialism passionately and almost kind of loudly out in public. Like maybe you might not connect with people, but a thing that you're doing while you're doing that in a public space, you're almost like normalizing it. You're making it part of society, and like in a society where kind of like the Red Scare is still very like prominent. I think normalizing socialism is a really, really good first step to try to like get people to show us in a new image. I think that's very important.
Yeah, what I heard there, which I think is very much key, is practice. Right? Like, if you never, if it like, I remember being in this, when I knocked on my first door for Bernie, my very first one, I've told the story before, I walked up to it 4 times before I actually knocked. I like walked up and like then walked away. I was like, no, not for me, not for me. Right. And so I don't necessarily recommend people necessarily start with that, but maybe, I mean, I don't think it's the worst thing. You know what I did was after 2 or 3 doors, then it was fun. Then I was like, oh, this is actually, I got over my anxiety. It's fine. So practice probably could have helped me avoid that initial anxiety, right? If I was actually not wanting to deal with that initial anxiety. So anyway, I absolutely agree. Practice that, and I will also throw the offer out there. I love to just like go somewhere and talk forever, and then I might drink like 1,000 beers, but that's part of the experience for me. But just talking about this stuff, just like you said, like it's invaluable. It's invaluable. Getting over that anxiety.
And I think it can also lead to finding those common areas, because the more you talk about it, even between ourselves, the more we start, picking out those areas where we do connect with other people and other groups that may think that they're separate from us. But talking to people is the same no matter what topic you're talking about. You have to find a way to connect to them on their level with something that impacts them directly. So the more we talk about it, the more we practice it, I think the more we build that skill to then connect with other people.
Yeah, and I would also like to throw in as an answer to the question is political education, stuff like this, like stuff that we're doing now, right? And taking that even further. But I know for me, over the years, the more I have learned, the easier it is to like make the point I want to make without like having to try to like repeat what was the line and the phrase and the which book and what chat, now it's just like common natural language. And I think that's one of the things that, practice and political education can give us. So I would like to move on to the next question, if that's all right, or the next item. Continuing solidarity actions with existing unions. Yes. So first question, do we have the capacity to do this?
Yes.
Do we?
Yeah, I would think so, because I don't think it's it's fantastic if we could get everyone in our chapter to show up to a labor action. That'd be fantastic. But I think it's a case where a little bit goes a long way. Like when we had the SEIU strike last year, a handful of us showed up a few times and we had really good conversations, and they really appreciated it, and it established a relationship. And I don't think we've really maintained that relationship, but I think that that was a really good experience and an example for us to follow in the future.
I would almost say we would need like a working group for this, and that's something that would that I feel like we might not have maybe the resources for, just because like I know it's kind of hard for us to find like 3 people to create the working group and then continually run it, but I feel like we would need that, so we can have people searching for these different strikes and having communications with those union leaders so we can help better organize. But that is something that maybe we can look to in the future.
I would add like one way we can also help facilitate this is using our social media platforms to continue posting events and information about different things that are going on. That's a good way to easily contribute without necessarily needing a bunch of bodies to go to different places.
Right. And I think the kind of the key to that when I read the item continuing solidarity actions with existing unions. I can't even answer if there's been other actions since that SEIU strike, right? Not necessarily with just SEIU, but just like around the city, right? And I know there has to have been some, right? Something where we could probably do solidarity actions. My point being, having that communication and knowing like what's going on, right? So I think the answer to this is like yes and no. I think that we have the capacity to turn out to an action, but I don't think we have the capacity to like make it a project where we work on it and like improve that process and things like that, right?
I'd also like to mention real quick, like with that SEIU strike, because the labor movement in this area is fairly limited, you know, having just 2 or 3 people show up does make a difference, because you're only talking about, you know, maybe 20, 30 people out there. And if you know what, 3 of our members show up, well, that's a 10% increase in the number of people who are there. So, I mean, it may seem like small potatoes at the time, but, you know, again, it doesn't take much to show that we're out there in the kind of limited space that's available to us. We want to grow that space, but, you know, we can't downplay that, you know, a few of us showing up does make a difference to those movements.
I think it can make a difference for sure. Okay, so next one, the next item is getting in on Amazon union organizing. Since we have one on its way. Do we have the capacity to do that?
On that one, I'm not as sure.
Yeah, I feel like it's dependent on who would be interested. Like, if you just asked me out of the people I know and where they're at currently, I would say no, but we've got a lot of people in our organization that aren't super involved, and maybe there is somebody who would want to be involved.
What about right now? Do we have the capacity to do this?
Yeah, I wouldn't think so.
To me, this one's an easy no. Very easy no. Not saying we shouldn't try. I'm just mean, do we have the capacity to like carry out the goal, right? So like, obviously the goal being to unionizing Amazon.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
I think that one's an easy no. We don't have the capacity to do that.
What were you gonna say, Noah?
I was gonna say it's really dependent on the level of interest of the Amazon workers. So I mean, like, if there's not an interest to unionize with the Amazon worker, then there's no shot that we have the capacity to do that. If there's a really, really high interest in unionizing with Amazon, then maybe, yeah. But it would have to be very, very high for us to be able to do that. And I think that we'd have to have like very high level people engaging with it as well.
Sorry, I didn't mean to jump in.
Oh, you're good. That's
what when I think about it, who's gonna teach them how to unionize in our chapter? I don't think anybody in our chapter knows how to unionize or has like, you know what I mean? Like, I know Blake, you had experience in Omaha organizing a newspaper there, and I'm sure you have stories, right? But like, you know what I'm saying? Like we don't have experience. It would be a new time shot in the dark type thing, right?
Right. And to be clear, I wasn't like involved from day one. I joined the unionization process, but yeah, I wasn't there on day one having conversations about what to do.
Right.
I was approached later on.
Sure.
I do want to point out that I think we're in a uniquely advantageous period to work on unionizing places like this because of the current, labor shortage that they talk about. In that right now, I think is the time when workers have finally started to realize they have more power than they realized they had for a long time. And I think it's one of those times where we need to be doing these things. We need to take advantage of that situation. We're at a time where 600,000 people recently died, and a lot of them were simply removed from the workforce. Well, this is the time when you need to get out there and say, people are starting to realize that they don't need to work for starvation wages. So there is a better way out there. So yeah, we need to work on our capacity, but I think this is the time to do it. This is when we need to make those strides. Because when people are comfortable, it's really hard to get them to move. But I think right now is a time when they're seeing it more than they have before, at least in their lifetimes.
Sure.
Not sure
Well,
how that helped. I just wanted to add.
yeah, no, well, and that leads to the second question, and we can end after this one. I wanted to get to at least one where we don't have the capacity, right? So that we can talk about what would we have to do though to actually attain that capacity, right? So I think a lot of what your answers were saying, like, it would be dependent on this. I think some of those were probably some answers to this question, but I'll just ask it. And like, what do we have to do to reach this capacity? To like get in on like organizing Amazon.
Part of it would probably be learning how to effectively organize. Like that's the most crucial part, is knowing how to do it. Until we know how to do it, whether we have people or not, doesn't matter. We have to be able to do the work in order to do the work.
That's a great answer. Yes.
It may also involve getting involved with, more involved with other established unions that are trying that. So maybe we expand our capability by doing more pairing up.
Right. Yes, absolutely. It's another good one.
And there's some good opportunities for something like mutual education on that front.
I think it'd be great to go picket like the job fair or whenever they start up for it, and just set up shop across the street and say, hey, while you're signing up for this, let's talk about organizing. Let's not wait. Let's do it from as soon as they're starting to try and hire people. Let's talk to those people.
Yeah, that's interesting. I never thought about trying to like organize at the job fair. I wonder how people would respond to that. That's interesting.
If nothing else, it starts the conversation.
Right. Sure. No, yeah.
Even if it just
Plants the
pisses off the people. Yeah. Even if it just pisses off the people trying to hire people. Well, hey, that's something.
Sure.
It's a place to start.
Right. So we have learning how to organize effectively. So like training, right? Like training with each other, practicing, learning this stuff. The second thing, getting more involved with other unions who might be trying to do that. Absolutely. That's obviously crucial. That's, it would be likely an existing union. It wouldn't be a brand new union likely. Getting started as early as is possible. Well, I'll just put as possible because the little blue lines there. Thanks, Google. Yeah, no, I think those are all absolutely crucial to that. One I would like to add is building labor resources within our own chapter. So that can come in many forms, but the most importantly being we're getting union members into our chapter. Either recruiting union, well, not either, both recruiting union members to our chapter. And then, and I think this was mentioned earlier too, is actually joining unions, where that's, feasible.
Yeah, just getting more people in general too. Either getting more people or like, I guess I can't think of a better word for it than like empowering or activating more people that we already have.
Right. Okay.
Well, and along that same line, I think it's easier to activate people when you have a concrete goal or thing you're shooting for that is very tangible. So like when we did the push to remove the Columbus statue, that was a very physical thing that people could see that we were working towards. And it was a goal that was right in front of them. So it's like, it's easier to activate people, I think, when there's a more tangible, achievable thing in front of them, and to get them involved. Then, it's hard to get people to just be involved in the education stuff because it seems so out there, whereas when it's a more direct action that they can work on, I think it's easier to get people more riled up for that and involved.
Yeah, and it's easier. People want to do political education more during that kind of thing when it's extremely relevant and they're interested in it too, right?
Yep, it keeps them involved.
Yeah.
I would add, in addition, just like having continual small targets is super helpful. Like people really appreciate having a small goal that they can work for rather than like our giant end goal that we're working towards.
Yeah.
Like we need to have those small baby steps along the way, even if it's just like recruiting more members. Like we want to recruit X number of members. Like it helps a lot.
So I'm going to add that to the list, developing an actual plan with goals.
With
Yeah.
achievable, stepped goals, I think is huge. Because again, when it's the same thing when we laid out, we want to get 10 signatures for this thing. Well, as soon as we get 10 signatures, the goal changes to 20. As soon as we hit 20, it goes to 50. But people can see that progress, and it doesn't seem like it's, pie in the sky too far off to achieve. When they see those achievable steps, even if they're small, it's a psychological thing. It's easier to sell people on those.
Absolutely. Okay, well, I actually would keep going, but I think it would be it is incumbent upon me to basically call this the end of this meeting. We're at 17 minutes over. I appreciate everybody staying and continuing to talk. What I would like to do is share just a few links on the topic today about workers, why socialists talk about workers so much, and just a few like just some articles you can read to go further than that. And I'm just going to copy all these into the agenda. Okay. So yeah, all of those links are free. I think they're all great. Vivek Chibber actually has a whole nother series called the ABCs of Capitalism, which is a 3-part pamphlet on how capitalism works. A+, we have it in the DSA library. So if you don't have access to that, let me know. But otherwise, thanks everybody for coming today. I think this is like a super crucial, important topic. I think it's one that is at the center of a lot of conflict that's on the left. And I think it's really important that we, grapple with it and come out of it in some kind of coherent way. So yeah, thank you everybody, and see you next week.
Sounds good.
Thanks,
Take care,
guys.
guys.
Thanks, gang. See ya.